Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a historic set review for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles set, which is the next set that's going to be dropping on Arena. I believe it comes out next week, so not long now till we get our hands on it. And as usual, what I've done is I've basically gone through the entire main set and the supplemental sets like the bonus sheet, and pulled out any cards that I think are likely to see play or have an impact, or could potentially see play in future. Going to be starting off with the more high impact stuff, and then we move more onto the fringe stuff as the video goes on. But anyway, let's just get straight into it. Starting off here with Food Chain, which hasn't been pre-banned yet, and I would be pretty surprised if it doesn't, but since it hasn't been pre-banned yet, I'm going to talk about it as if it is going to be legal. And if it is, I'm kind of worried because I do think this could be one of the most powerful combo enablers that we've got. So if you've not seen this card before, it's basically a way that is most commonly used to produce infinite mana. So if we have a look at Legacy, where it's legal and played a decent amount at the moment, it's usually used with cards that can be cast from exile, like Squee the Immortal. So the idea here is, with Food Chain and Squee, you exile the Squee to the Food Chain, get 4 mana, then you can spend 3 of that 4 mana to recast Squee from exile, and then you've just got a loop here where you're just producing an extra mana every single time. So a very easy way to produce infinite mana. Now the big issue with this is that cards like Squee are pretty terrible when you don't have Food Chain, but obviously it's a Goblin, so you could just run this in the Goblin shell with Goblin Matron, and then that's pretty nice because you can go Food Chain into Goblin Matron, search Squee, immediately exile the Matron to produce 4 mana, and then cast the Squee, and you're just good to go and combo off straight away. And then additionally, when we recently got Hexing Squelcher, being able to cast Hexing Squelcher on 2 to then make Food Chain uncounterable on 3 seems like a really big deal, especially against decks like Dimir, where they're probably reliant on counterspells to stop your enchantments, because Dimir as a color combination doesn't have great ways to remove enchantments to begin with, so that seems very powerful. Not to mention, I think Food Chain is just a generically powerful card in Goblins when you don't have Squee anyway, right? If you cast a Ringleader, for example, and you put 2 or 3 Goblins in your hand off that, you can immediately exile the Ringleader to then cast what you draw. It makes ramping into Muxus way easier, so it's going to be very easy to turn that infinite mana into a same turn kill, I think. We do have some other options as well, like Eternal Scourge is another card that we have that we can cast from exile, but like I said, cards like Eternal Scourge and Squee, the big weaknesses, they're pretty terrible on their own, and without a good way to tutor it, if you're running 4 Eternal Scourge, your deck's going to end up with a lot of terrible draws where you just don't have a good use for this. However, outside of that, I think we have a way better option on Arena already in Sir Guardian Evangel, because this is not only a card that is much better to run as a 4-of, it is a generically powerful card on its own when you don't have Food Chain, which is a big upside compared to cards like Squee and Eternal Scourge, but it also doubles up as a win condition. So the way this works is you cast your Sir Guardian Evangel, conjure another one into your hand, exile it to Food Chain to produce 3 mana, spend 2 of that 3 mana to cast the Guardian Evangel again, conjure another one into your hand, and then, like Squee, you have a way to produce infinite mana. But unlike Squee, once you have that infinite mana, you can just pump that into Sir Guardian Evangel, tap down your opponent's lands, and then end the turn with essentially infinite 3/1s, or as many 3/1s as you can make before Arena times you out, which obviously is very significantly better than Squee, because, like I said, you can much more easily run it as a 4-of, and it doubles up as a win condition. You don't need to have another card in your hand. Obviously, there are some weaknesses of it, compared to Primal Prayers, which obviously uses Evangel itself. You can't cast the creatures at instant speed, meaning you can't tap down the opponent's lands, so you are vulnerable to decks that run board sweepers, right? You give the opponent the opportunity to untap and then sweep the board, or if the opponent's playing a combo deck, you give the opponent the opportunity to untap and then combo off, because you do have to wait a turn cycle to attack with the Guardian Evangel. But I think if you're running Evangel, you're very likely to be running Recruiter of the Guard, because similar to Goblin Matron, you can go Food Chain into Recruiter, search the Guardian Evangel, exile the Recruiter to Food Chain to produce the mana for you to start comboing off with the Evangel, which also means that if you have a Recruiter in hand when you're comboing off with Evangel, you could just run a one-off card like Witty Roastmaster, for example, use some of the infinite mana to cast Recruiter to search for Witty Roastmaster, use some of the infinite mana to cast the Witty Roastmaster, and then you just dome the opponent and win the same turn with Evangel as well. So there are going to be ways to turn this into a same turn kill and avoid those sorts of issues. My big worry with this is that it just seems like the deck can be built in so many different ways, right? If you are running this combo, all you really need is 4 Food Chain, 4 Sir Guardian Evangel, 4 Recruiter of the Guard, and then you can just fill the rest of the deck with whatever you want. If you wanted to go more all in on the combo, you could obviously run stuff like Enlightened Tutor to find Food Chain more consistently. You could very easily combine it with Primal Prayers, because there's a lot of crossover synergies here, right? Primal Prayers obviously wants to run Evangel and Recruiter itself, And the big issue I've had with Primal Prayers over the years when I've tested it is that you have a lot of ways to tutor your creature combo pieces, but there aren't really that many great ways to find Primal Prayers itself, right? I think a lot of people have been running Crucius in order to tutor it, but now if they do allow Food Chain to be legal, you could just run 4 Food Chain, 4 Primal Prayers, and then like I said, there's a ton of crossover synergy. Cards like Guide of Souls are also nice with Food Chain and Evangel, because then it gives you infinite life and infinite energy, which means that if the opponent's running a damage-based combo, for example, it shuts them off winning that way as well. You could run it in just a pure human aggro deck, and then just have Food Chain as a random I win the game sometimes if you just have it. You could run it in like a controlling shell. There's so many different ways that you can build it that I am a little bit worried about the power level of this, but obviously they do still have time to pre-ban it. But if they don't, this is definitely the first deck I'm going to be trying once the set drops. Then next up, we've got another card that I've been wanting on the client for such a long time in Arcbound Ravager, and it feels to me like this is potentially the missing piece for Hardened Scales to be viable. Now, I'm not sure what tier it would be with Arcbound Ravager, but having tried the deck multiple times in the past, having a sack outlet to, stack stuff on Ozolith and move all your counters around does really feel like the missing piece to make the deck super explosive and be able to close the game out of nowhere. And I also think that we do have some arena exclusive cards that are very good and could give the deck an edge over maybe even the modern variants, for example. So we have Hardened Bonds, which gives the deck a really good way to grind into long games, which seems very good right now in kind of the slower Dimir and Jund dominated format. We have Hangerback Assembler, which gives us a way to, outscale the opponent if we can consistently keep dealing damage over a number of turns. So I feel like the deck has good ways to grind into long games, and additionally we also have Lurrus still legal as well. So it feels to me like Hardened Scales could actually be a really strong deck in that Arcbound Ravager really feels like the missing piece to give the deck explosivity to be able to close the game out early on. And between Hardened Bonds, Lurrus and Hangerback Assembler, it feels like the deck also now has good ways to grind into the long game as well. So I'm very excited to play it. I'm sure it's going to be a technically difficult deck to play, so I'm sure there's a high skill ceiling on it as well, but really, really excited to try it out there. And then additionally, there are some other shells that have been wanting Arcbound Ravager as well. I think, like when I've been playing Affinity recently, I've been trying builds with Pinnacle Emissary and Weapons Manufacturing as a way to accelerate into Kappa Cannoneer more consistently. But the issue with that is that Weapons Manufacturing is pretty lackluster if you don't have a way to sacrifice your tokens. You can run Ratchet Bomb at the moment, which, I've seen a few people doing, but Ratchet Bomb as a, card isn't that great on its own, whereas Arcbound Ravager can be useful, and then once you do have Weapons Manufacturing down, you can just sacrifice all of your tokens that you make off manufacturing to dome the opponent for 2 as well. So Ravager plus Emissary and Weapons Manufacturing seems like a really nice way that you could build Affinity if you're going more all in on Kappa Cannoneer as well. So very, very excited to try this one out once it drops as well. Then another card, I'm kind of going to talk about the archetypes together, because there is another a few archetypes that are getting options. So while we're talking about Hardened Scales, I might as well also talk about the Ooze, which is basically a slower Ozolith that also provides you with some graveyard hate. So it's kind of similar to Ozolith in that when creatures die with +1/+1 counters on it, you can then get that back through your mutagen tokens. Now, it is significantly slower than the Ozolith because you have to invest 1 mana to use each of your mutagen tokens, whereas Ozolith just puts the counters straight on the creature. So as a replacement for Ozolith, I don't think this is really the one. But obviously Ozolith is legendary, so there's a limit to how many you can run. So I think whether or how good this card is will largely depend on how good the graveyard hate aspect of it is. Now, having said that, we do also have Agatha's Soul Cauldron, which is another main deckable Hardened Scales card that synergizes well with your proactive game plan and provides you with incidental graveyard hate as well. But you could definitely run them both together, and there is decent uses for graveyard hate at the moment. I think, limiting the size of the Goyfs against Jund and also cutting the opponent off stuff to cast with Jarsil is quite important. Against Dimir, they obviously have Psychic Frog that uses the graveyard. They have Snapcaster Mage. They have Treasure Cruise. And then there are obviously some more graveyard-focused strategies like Is It Phoenix and Reanimator that still see play as well. So the Ooze does seem like a decent option, but I doubt it's going to see more than a one-off. I think if you're running this, it's probably to just give you some incidental graveyard hate and give you kind of like an Ozolith style effect without having to run too many of legendary cards, if that makes sense. The next up, we're going to be moving on to the affinity cards, starting off here with Sewer Valence Cam, which I'm pretty excited about. So this is pretty nice because it doubles up as kind of early interaction, because obviously you can flash this in to tap down your opponent's creatures, which is going to be very relevant against aggro. I do feel like one of the big weaknesses of Affinity is you do tend to struggle against decks like Is It Wizards and Boros Auras that, if you don't have early interaction, can really outrace you before you get your main engines online. And so being able to tap down the opponent's creatures, especially against auras, seems very powerful. But the main thing I'm excited to do with this is using it to untap Emery, especially with Drix Interlacer, because I think outside of Kappa Cannoneer, the best thing to be doing in Affinity right now is reusing Drix Interlacer with Emery and being able to go, get a bunch of counters on Drix Interlacer, draw 3 or 4 cards, replay it with Emery, and then draw even more. And then if you draw it into Sewer Valence Cam, you just flash it in, untap Emery, recast Drix Interlacer. You could genuinely draw like 15, 20 cards in a single turn if you just keep using Sewer Valence Cam to untap Emery. So I'm really excited to try it out in that shell. There are some potential infinite combos that you can do with Goblin Engineer as well, but I feel like you're making your deck a lot worse to try and do that thing, and it's kind of a convoluted combo to set up. I think if Affinity was already running Goblin Engineer, or there was already a good Goblin Engineer deck, then I'd be kind of excited to try it there. But since there isn't really one, it doesn't really feel worth it to run just for this. I'm mainly excited for it in just generic Affinity as good early way to tap the opponent's creatures down that also gets an artifact in play, and then just is very good with Emery. And then also later in the game, you can obviously sack it to draw 2 cards and then recast it with Emery to then untap itself and recast something else. So yeah, very excited to try this one out in Affinity for sure. Then another new tool that Affinity gets is Krang Mastermind, which kind of feels like sort of halfway between Thought Monitor and Kappa Cannoneer, right? So it has affinity for artifacts, and it's 8 mana. Very importantly, it's double blue, so it's slightly harder to cast than a Thought Monitor because you do need a second actual blue mana, but it does sort of provide you with a similar effect, especially if you're empty-handed and you're using this to draw 4. It's incredibly powerful. And then it also works as a much bigger body as well, right? The big issue with Thought Monitor is that, it does just get on the board and keep the cards flowing, but it doesn't actually impact the board that much in terms of closing the game out, whereas this does seem like it'll be very big. Now, having said that, it doesn't have any form of evasion, but you can run cards like Shadow Spear to potentially give it trample and lifelink, which will be very powerful. So I think it's an interesting halfway house. I'm still not sure it's going to replace Kappa Cannoneer because the unblockable in Ward 4 is so powerful on that card, but I haven't been massively impressed with Thought Monitor recently, and this alongside Drix Interlacer does seem like a very nice combination of ways to ensure that you have card advantage, and obviously then doubles up as a threat as well. It wouldn't surprise me if you run, 3 or 4 Kappa Cannoneer and then 1 or 2 of this. And then you could also run equipment like Shadow Spear as well to make this more effective at kind of piercing through board stalls as well. But yeah, not 100% sure the correct ratios, but this is definitely another one that I'm going to be trying out at the top end of Affinity. Then we've got some other more fringe options for Affinity. Fugitive Droid does seem like it could be useful as maybe a sideboard card. I'm not that interested in the can't be blocked mode because it is just a 1/1 that doesn't really grow, but the ability to pay 1 and sack it to just protect any of your creatures seems pretty big, especially Emery, because like I said, the main thing that I'm really impressed with Affinity is Emery reusing Drix Interlacer, and especially against decks like Jund or Dimir or even like Is It Wizards, the ability to protect your Emery, the ability to protect your Kappa Cannoneer if the opponent can pay the Ward 4 also seems very powerful. So this does seem like a potential sideboard option if you're worried about the opponent interacting with you quite a lot in the early game. Although having said that, I do think the main interaction that you're worried about from Affinity, especially against decks like Jund, is stuff like Meltdown or Divine Purge that can just sweep your entire board, which Fugitive Droid doesn't really help with. So there's a chance this isn't good enough, but if you are worried about spot removal killing your main threats, this is definitely an option you can consider. The next time we've got Improvised Arsenal, which is quite interesting because we don't have cranial plating on Arena, so this is basically that sort of effect, which the equip cost being red as opposed to colourless is a downside, but the ability to sink mana into it to duplicate it does seem very nice as well. And then obviously Affinity does have a number of flyers that you can attach this to that means that you don't need to run cards like Shadow Spear for it to be effective. So definitely an interesting option. There is some incentive to already be in red in Affinity because you want to be able to hardcast Pinnacle Emissary in a lot of situations. So definitely another option. Again, it's going to be tricky because we're getting so many options for top end in Affinity that it honestly wouldn't surprise me that much if this doesn't see the cut, because Affinity is already a really tight deck. You already have Kappa Cannoneer, Thoughtcast, Thought Monitor, Krang as options. So not 100% sure this will make the cut, but it's definitely an interesting one to consider, I think. Same sort of thing with Ravenous Robots as well. I do think that there is real appeal to running artifacts that also produce other artifacts. in order to accelerate into Kappa Cannoneer more consistently, because that does seem like the most generically powerful way to close the game out, and being able to close the game out quickly is one of the big weaknesses of Affinity at the moment, in my opinion. And Ravenous Robots gives you another option. Now, having said that, like I said earlier, we do already have Pinnacle Emissary and Weapons Manufacturing, and I'm not sure this is better than either of them, really, because it's a little bit more expensive than Pinnacle Emissary, and it's much easier to kill than Weapons Manufacturing, right? It being a creature, especially a 1 toughness creature, means it does die to way more stuff. And so I think if you are running cards to just spam the board with artifacts in order to accelerate into your top end, or, you know, build up your Drix Scintillators a lot more quickly, I do probably think that Pinnacle Emissary and Weapons Manufacturing are probably better, especially now we have Arcbound Ravager, but there's a chance I'm wrong on that. Maybe you do want to go a little bit more creature-based, in which case Ravenous Robots could be better, but it's an interesting option if you did want to have more of those ways to accelerate into Kappa Cannoneer and, you know, build up your Drix Scintillators a little bit more quickly, which is pretty nice. And then we've also got Skateboard, which is mainly just going to be an option instead of Lava Spur Boots, which isn't that common. I do see play, especially in the Tezzeret builds, as a one-off to give your Kappa Cannoneer haste. But again, if that's the main reason you're using it, maybe Lava Spur Boots is more important for the Ward one, because the main reason to give your Kappa Cannoneer haste is to, you know, be able to attack with it, and if you're attacking with it, you're likely going to be able to have it unblockable anyway, at which point tapping down something doesn't seem that good. But, you know, if you want to use it to give your Emery haste, maybe tapping down an opponent's creature is useful, but again, it's pretty minor. Lava Spur Boots doesn't see that much play, and this is just kind of an alternative to that, if that makes sense. But Affinity definitely getting some interesting tools, and it'll definitely be another archetype I'm going to be returning to try and figure out an optimal version of. The next up, we're going to be moving on to ninjas. So first of all, we've got Dream Beavers, which basically just seems like a better version of the Fairy Seer, I believe is what it's called. So, you know, it's a flying creature that scries 1 when it enters. Obviously, it doesn't scry as much, but it does provide some chip damage. So again, it's not strictly better, and maybe the scry 2 is more valuable, but in a tempo deck that is trying to apply pressure more early on, being able to drain the opponent, especially if you're bouncing it to your hand repeatedly for your ninjutsu creatures, does seem probably more valuable to me. That extra damage every single time, that extra little bit of life gain against the aggressive decks does seem useful. So I'm definitely going to be trying it out in place of Fairy Seer, but kind of a slightly minor upgrade there. Nothing too special. But we do have some other cards. Instead of ninjutsu, we've got this ability called Sneak, which is kind of essentially the same thing. And there are 2 cards that I want to highlight here. First of all, Splinter Hamato Yoshi is basically another version of I forget the name of it. There's a Lord effect that's already... Oh, Silver Fur Master, that's the one. So I don't think this is better than Silver Fur Master, but if you do want to run more Lord effects, which I do think there's a reasonable chance, maybe you want to run a 5th or 6th copy of Silver Fur Master, then you could run this as a 1 or 2 of an addition to it. If you just wanted to run a more aggressive deck that's more about just getting as much damage as you can and quickly, which, you know, I think would also work very well with Dream Beavers. So if you want to run copies 5 and 6 of Silver Fur Master, this is definitely an option. Not 100% sure you do. Maybe you want to run more Eurekos or more card advantage engines, but definitely an option there for sure. And then Dark Leo and Shredder, I'm less sure about, because it does involve a splash, which definitely does come at a cost right now, with Harbinger and Magus still seeing some play. And there aren't really that many other white cards that you really want to get access to, right? I feel like the extra splash does come with significant cost. But if you do want to splash white, this does provide you with, you know, not only extra ninjas on the board, which works very well with Eureka, but it also, you know, potentially gives you a way to deal huge amounts of damage if you can swarm a lot of ninjas in the battlefield very quickly. Now, again, I think ninjas already has a lot of options within Dimir. I don't really think a white splash is worth it unless there are other white sideboard cards that you want to run, but I thought I'd highlight it because it's definitely an option for ninja players going forwards. And then, not in the same deck, but it is another Sneak card I want to talk about. Kitsune's Technique is a very interesting mill card, right? If you can sneak this in on turn 2, milling the opponent, half the opponent's library for 2 mana is incredibly good on rate. Now, I think the problem we've got in Historic is we just don't have enough good cheap creatures that Mill wants to be running. We obviously have Ruin Crab, but we don't have Hedron Crab. I think you really want to be running a high density of 1-drops for this to be playable, but I mean, milling half the opponent's library is such a high amount that maybe you cut back on mill a little bit and run some generically powerful 1-drops, like maybe you run Hydroponics Architect and Tameo as your 1-drops alongside Ruin Crab to then enable this as sort of a more generically powerful mill card, and then, you know, you have more long game because the Hydroponics Architect and Tamio will help you draw cards going into the late game as well. But having said that, Mill as an archetype hasn't ever really been good, especially in best of 3. Maybe there's been points where it's been good in best of 1, but maybe this is the card that pushes it over the edge. I'm definitely going to be trying it out. Again, there is the weakness that it's pretty bad in multiples, right? The first one on turn 2 is going to be huge, but if you cut generic Mill to run this, then the second or third copies of it are going to be pretty bad because, if you've halved the opponent's library, then halving it again isn't actually going to be milling as much, if that makes sense. But it's definitely an interesting card, maybe one to, look at again if we do get Hedron Crab legal. But I thought I'd highlight it because it does seem like one of the most generically powerful mill cards that we've got in a while. The next up, we got Leonardo's Technique. So we're moving on to more of the fringe stuff now. And this one is kind of interesting to me because it does seem pretty good on rate. I don't think there's a great home for it right now. Although having said that, I have seen and played some Boros Madness decks that are utilizing cards like Seasoned Pyromancer and Flage alongside Faithless Looting. So, you can potentially fill your graveyard with those powerful 3-drops, and then if you pay 4 mana and you get 2 3-drops back, that's decent rate. It's basically Collected Company. And then if you ever sneak it, that's even more powerful as well. So don't think it's got a great home right now, but if you are running a Madness style deck with cards like Flage, Seasoned Pyromancer, it does seem decent there. But having said that, those decks already run decent options. You're already running Seasoned Pyromancer to be able to grind into long games. You're already running Madness cards to turn your Faithless Looting and Fable of the Mirror Breakers and whatnot into card advantage. So I'm not sure those sorts of decks need more card advantage, especially when a card like this is, weak to graveyard hate and requires setup as well. So again, not sure it's got a great home right now, but it is decent on rate in theory. So maybe there's a deck in future that does want this. We'll have to see. Then next up, we got Raph and Leo's Sibling Rivals, which is kind of reminiscent of Fear of Missing Out a little bit. So I think for this card to be good, you do need to be able to give it haste. Arena of Glory is still kind of clunky because we don't have that many actual mountains that are playable in the mana base, but we do also have stuff like Swift Spear's Teachings and Detective's Phoenix as well, and the ability to untap 2 creatures where Fear of Missing Out only does 1 does seem very powerful to me, especially alongside cards like Barrogoyf or Flage, for example. So again, I'm not sure what the best home for this would be. Maybe it is a little win more as well, because at least Fear of Missing Out enables your discard synergies, whereas this, it does need quite a lot to go right for it to be effective. But on a power level, scale and just on terms of rate, it does seem powerful. So if you are running a deck with, Detective's Phoenix, Arena of Glory, maybe Swift Spear's Teachings, then, it does seem pretty powerful. So I'll definitely be trying it out in that sort of shell. Maybe like a Boros Madness shell that I was talking about a second ago. The next thing we got Cool But Rude, which I'm not that interested in. The passive ability of looting whenever you attack does seem useful, but the main thing that draws me to this is the second level, right? Once you get this off to level 2, dealing your opponent 2 damage every time you discard a card seems incredibly good to me, right? Like I said, if you are running that sort of Madness aggressive style deck with Faithless Looting and Fable of the Mirror Breaker and Fear of Missing Out and stuff like that, this seems like it could deal a lot of damage very quickly. Now, having said that, it is a lot of mana investment and it does seem quite slow, right? It's 2 mana to get it down. You really need a 1-drop in play to then get use out of it immediately, and then it's another 2 mana to get this online. So maybe in 2026 Historic it is a little bit too slow, but that level 2 did seem powerful enough to me that I'm definitely at least going to be trying it out. So maybe that sort of mono red or Boros Madness style aggro deck is worth returning to, because we are getting a few new tools from this latest set. And then finally, the last card I want to talk about here is Does Machines. This is definitely a fringe one, but I wanted to talk about it because even without level 2 and 3, just when it enters mill 2, draw 2, discard 2, was the sort of card that I was looking for quite recently when I was trying to build Aquatic Subtlety with Scholar and Hidetsugu with Necromancy as somewhat of a plan B, because Necromancy can obviously sacrifice Hidetsugu before the end step if you do it at instant speed, to provide you with redundancy for Aquatic Subtlety. And the big issue I had when I was trying to build that deck was just that in blue-black, there really weren't that many good options at 2 mana that draw 2 and discard 2, and then this obviously mills 2 as well. But the reason I wanted to do that was because, obviously with Scholar, if you want Scholar to work with Necromancy or just Reanimation in general, you need to discard Scholar and an expensive sorcery to go alongside it. And so now this gives us, a good 2-mana card that can draw 2, discard 2 on turn 2 to allow us to necromancy on turn 3, so you can discard Scholar and an expensive sorcery, and then you also mill 2, which is even better, because then if you could get lucky and mill over an expensive sorcery or a Scholar even if you don't have one yet. And so I thought it was worth highlighting. Again, that deck obviously isn't playable anymore because of the Scholar ban, but I wanted to highlight it because I was looking for this sort of card very recently, and now we've suddenly got it. If there is another deck like that where you need to pitch, a creature to reanimate and a spell in the graveyard to use with that creature, then this seems like a decent option. And then obviously, if you're running this in an artifact-based combo deck, level 2 and level 3 giving you even more value off it seems really nice as well. But I thought I would highlight this because this is basically the card I was looking for when building a deck quite recently. But anyway, those are all the cards I wanted to talk about. Not as many from this set, unfortunately. Usually I will do a bonus sheet review and then a separate main set review, so there aren't that many. But if Food Chain isn't pre-banned, I think this one is going to be absolutely massive in terms of how powerful it's going to be. Arcbound Ravager, I'm really, really excited for in Hardened Scale specifically, because it does feel like that deck has tons of tools to grind into the long game, but it was really missing that explosivity that enables you to kill very quickly, which is what makes it so powerful in Modern, for example. And I think Ravager was the missing piece. And then it's going to be super interesting figuring out the optimal build of Affinity going forwards. I think Ninjas is a deck that's massively benefited from the recent BNR, and we get some new tools for that as well. So yeah, there are definitely a few decks that I'm very interested in trying out once this set drops. Definitely let me know in the comments if there's any cards you think I missed out, or if there's any applications of these cards that I didn't mention, or just in general what you're excited to brew with once the set comes out, because I'm going to be trying a bunch of different ideas, and it'll be really interesting to hear what you guys are thinking of. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video. Really excited to pick these cards up, and hopefully I'll have a bunch of new deck guides and stuff like that, brews from scratch, under the meta, whatever the case may be, built around some of these cards. But yeah, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Big up.